a donor requirement. But actually, as Phil mentioned it earlier, it's one of the very important decision-making tool in the development sector. It also is a tool to see how you are performing in regards to your goal or objective, or your day-to-day activities of your project. In addition, it's also a risk mitigation tool, a monitoring and evaluation, which is planned well on time. We have to be careful that I have to say that on time is an important risk mitigation tool for decision makers. It indicates the progress or lack thereof your project, as I said earlier. And then there are times that these days that it is a donor's requirement, especially these days, it is one of the very important requirements the donor is asking. In addition to your capacity or the organization capacity or the implementer capacity, donors require that monitoring and evaluation is part of your proposal before even doing the project implementation. So they make sure that you have a potential person or human resources structure within the organization before you get that project. And the other one is the accountability features. It is an accountability features because that again, that we are accountable to so many people in there, everyone. We are accountable to our stakeholders, which includes our partners within the country we are working on. We are accountable to our beneficiaries, those people, whether they are children, girls or boys, or people within community which we are working on, we are accountable to them. And the implementer, again, we're accountable to the donor. Beneficiaries, as I said earlier, include our partners, the partners which we are working in different parts of the world are in some cases our beneficiaries because they are part of, as Phil was saying earlier, the capacity building, or they are involved. The local government bodies, they are our partners. Communities, all level communities, district or regional level, at all level, we have our beneficiaries. So we are accountable also to them as donors and beneficiaries. The organization project life cycle, which Phil showed it earlier in different types of diagram, is shown in here at the front as you see. Those 4 phases are the initiation phase, the planning phase, and the execution phase. And then by the end of the day, the project closure. As I put it in there at the top on all right part of the presentation, the monitoring and evaluation component is involved at all levels. For example, the initiation phase, again, which was mentioned earlier, it's about the community identification phase. There is something we call needs assessment, which we have to do before we even start planning. So when we do the initiation phase, the needs assessment requires the knowledge of the monitoring and evaluations. And then it also needs the human resources, the budget, the capacity, the community involvement. All those things are related to monitoring and evaluation component. What is that the community needs? What kind of resources the community has? Where are the church, the mosque? Who are the opinion leaders within that community or within that country? And then what is the problem statement for this project? So in this phase, as we said earlier as well, it involves again all stakeholders which are benefiting from this project at any point, including those who will be remaining or who will be staying there for a longer period than the life of the project. Now, during the planning phase, the M&E component is actually the major player when we are doing the planning component of a project. In most organizations I've been part of, the planning process in some cases are organized by the person or by the person who is in charge of the monitoring and evaluation component, because we have to make sure that the planning is well planned, it's well articulated, it's specific, measurable, achievable, and then timely information is in place. Because within that, whatever we've done at that point is going to follow us for the rest of the life of the project. So we have to make sure that during the planning phase, that the monitoring and evaluation component is also integrated in there. It is possible that during the planning phase that there are some financial part, which is part of the game, but the M&E part is also very, very important within that component of the project life cycle. During the execution period, the decision maker as a tool, as a decision maker tool, during the execution phase of a project, the monitoring and evaluation component gives a day-to-day, a month-to-month, a quarter or annual progress of the project or the execution of the planned project on a timely manner to decision makers. And then that gives a chance to decision makers to make any corrective actions or to plan it accordingly, or to make sure that to adjust what needs to be adjusted, including the budgeting, including the execution, including activity, including the area of interventions. What is happening? How is it going with the stakeholders? How is their capacity in regards to monitoring and evaluation? Are we building their monitoring and evaluation capacity? Now, during the closures, the project closure phase, which is the fourth or the last part of the project in there is a major activity which is done by the monitoring and evaluation personnel or with all stakeholders who are involved in there. That is whether we have made a progress or whether we have achieved our goal or the outcome which we're looking for at the beginning of the project. So there is an evaluation component which has to be done. The final report, sharing information to donors, stakeholders, all those things is going to be part of the project closure. And that information, which is mainly managed by the monitoring and evaluation component or the system, the monitoring and evaluation system or the monitoring and evaluation personnel, human resources, is a very crucial and an important factor within that project life cycle. So as I said, that it is a good practice. It is something which is happening in most development, in the most, if not all development sectors, that the integrations of monitoring and evaluation from initiation, that means from finding out what the problem of the area, the community is, all the way to the final stage of the project closure, whether we have achieved or not achieved or closer to the goal, is very important to integrate that part of the monitoring and evaluation. So now I'm going to go see in detail what each and every one of these things are. As I said earlier, I keep saying monitoring and evaluations, and then they are the two sides of the coin, and one needs another, and then one builds on the other work. So it is they are very much related, but it is very important to understand the distinction between those two. As you see it in there, the monitoring component it's a continuous and then a routine data collections to assess the progress and during the implementations of a project. It answers the questions: what are we doing? What are we doing last quarter? What are we doing this month? What have we planned? So mainly it is a routine follow-up of the project in a pre-planned manner, well-organized, systematic ways of identifying what we have done. as I put it in there, it's routine. It's a continuous activity from the beginning of the project to the end of the project. It's a continuous activity. Remember that from my experience, especially if the monitoring or both the monitoring and evaluation component is introduced at a later time, stakeholders, some partners might take it as a policing tool, as an auditing tool. So we have to make sure that that is not in case. This is not about policing. This is not about auditing. This is a tool, a management tool. When I say management, I didn't mean that the managers of the donor or the managers of the implementer. It is also a tool for partners within communities who are part of the project. So it is a management tool. It's not an auditing tool. It's not a policing tool. So that distinction or that understanding has to be in place, because as I was saying earlier, I have that experience that in some communities that information was not, the monitoring component of the information was not coming on time, because there is a scarcity that we are policing them, we are watching them, we are auditing them. So that needs to be clarified. As I said, the best way for this and the solution from my experience on this is that to start at the beginning and then to engage stakeholders at all levels. So as you said in there, what are we counting? As I said again, that there are activities which are happening within the communities daily, monthly, and then those activities are in some cases are being completed or not completed. So we assign a predefined indicators or markers so that we are following that completion or not completion or in progress of that activity by reporting on those indicators. So the programmatic activities could be anything, the distributions of school materials, the training of teachers, or all those things which is happening, as I said, that according to the plan earlier. Monitoring, in some cases, you might see it in some documentation that they also call it process evaluation. It's just a naming in there. It's not an evaluation, but they say it has a name called process evaluation. It's just that the process most probably is showing the continuous part of that activity. So in here, I mean, who is collecting the information, as I mentioned it at some point, are all stakeholders has to be involved. But if you're looking for the implementers, there are some people like program or project managers, coordinators, monitoring and evaluation officers, directors, all those things are involved in there. The place where you are collecting this information is very important. And then it also depends on the kind of intervention you have. I think, as most probably you learned it at some point or from your experience, there is a facility level intervention, and then there is a community level intervention. Facility level intervention is easy to collect information and then data because it's based on that facility. Example could be a school. If you have a specific school, or if your project is working only in school, it is very easy to collect information. The same thing with health posts or health centers or health facilities. It's a facility level intervention. It's very easy to integrate, be part of a monitoring to an existing part. Yes, we have to be careful. From my experience in there, there are people who are working in there who are hired by local authorities who get paid for doing only a certain point, a certain job. And then when project comes, it becomes an additional burden, the reporting part. So we have to make sure that there is enough human capacity, including the involvement of community members, to make sure that we have a timely report coming at all levels. for our donors and then for our implementers. As I said at the beginning, this is a continuous and then which lives from the beginning of a project to the end of the project. The fact that this thing is continuous, the fact that monitoring is continuous within the life of a project, it helps us also to conduct additional things. For example, I don't know if anybody is aware of what supportive supervision is. A supportive supervision is that by going to stakeholders who are working with the implementers within the community, and then based on whether it is the project, whether it's a project manager or the monitoring and evaluation officers, and then see what they're doing, how they are doing things, by seeing and then providing support and a hands-on support or a supportive, and then putting them in a supportive environment, you are building their capacity. So this continuous monitoring also prepare us to conduct that supportive supervision, which in some companies, in some organizations, happening every quarter. People go to the field. I usually go to the field in different countries. And then my main work in there is that to see what's been reported so far, whether there is an understanding, whether there is a use of that information, and then if not, I'll provide a feedback on how that is working and then how it is going to be done. And then if there is a challenge, if they have a question, that question will be answered. And then this is something which is going to build up or cascade it from time to time. And then every time you go for the second or third time, you keep building on what happened in the previous visit. In addition to that supportive supervision, which is happening frequently also, the monitoring part also is integrated in ensuring the quality of information coming to the implementers and the donors, and then also the stakeholders, assuring the quality of information, assuring data quality. So in most cases that this monitoring information is followed with what it's called a review meeting. That means this information which comes into light at different levels will be reviewed or has been reviewed every quarter, every 6 months or annually to see what is lagging and then what is happening on the right time. So as you can see in there, some companies, if they have the capacity, can see that monitoring part in different ways by building a dashboard. I'll come to that sometimes at a later time. Please let me know if I'm a bit faster or I'm not making sense of.
Thanks, Wosan. And also I thought I'd mention if anyone has any questions, maybe just interrupt Wosan as he's going through.
Yes.
Or if anything needs re-explaining or explaining again, just let him know.
Yes. Or if I have to repeat anything, please let me know.
Yeah, thank you. Great.
Thank you very much. Okay. So the indicators are the one I mentioned earlier, which the monitoring component are attached on. They are markers. They are similar to your dashboard in your car. You can see whether the gas, you're going to run out of gas, whether you need to check your engine, oil, or whatever. The indicators are attached to those monitoring activities, so you can check them from time to time. So it is always very important that you have a specific and measurable and then attainable indicators. I think this will be defined when we are talking about the log from the logical framework or the RBM part of the monitoring and evaluation, which Phil mentioned a little bit earlier. So when we monitor, it is possible that we are monitoring or we are collecting different types of data. There are this quantitative data, and then there are these qualitative data. The quantitative part, as the name suggests in there, they are very much numerical. They are almost considered structured, and they are quickly organized. And in some cases that we can put them on something called relational database. And one example which can be easily related to those are the things which we usually put on a spreadsheet, on an Excel spreadsheet. So these are something which we can count, like the number of teachers, percentage of educational materials, schools, children, or pen and pencil distributed. So it is similar in there that your indicator could be attached to this type of the quantitative data. The quantitative data collections always needs a tool or a pre-prepared template, which you need to share with all those who are reporting it. And what we see in Excel type at the front in here is attached to indicators. These are actually a data collection tool for a very quantitative data collection. Quantitative data can be collected in a face-to-face interview, whether you're doing a baseline or midline or endline evaluation or in normal monitoring activities. It could be collected in a telephone interviews, which we are used to here in North America. There are lots of phone calls happening. I don't think they are doing it now. I think in the previous years, there used to be a frequent telephone call, whether I like the Colgate I'm using, or which type of Colgate or which type of toothpaste I'm using. So, and then there is also facility or community registers. I think most community facility-based interventions has registers within their facilities, and then some of the quantitative data are usually get picked from there. And community, in some communities, not all communities, also have registered. A well-organized one has that kind of registers, and then that kind of quantitative data is also collected from there. And as I said earlier, that it is always good to have a predefined questionnaires or templates to make sure that data quality is assured when we are doing that collections. The qualitative data is usually unstructured compared to the qualitative data. It is always us trying to answer the why and then the how type of questions. Don't get me wrong in here that in data collections, whether you are doing any assessment or, as I said earlier, needs assessment or whatever, you can mix both of them and then have a well structured and well-rounded information from the communities. In addition to finding a yes and no questions or how many questions, you can always ask how and then elaborate on those questions. So qualitative, the qualitative data is very informative. For sure, making sense of a qualitative data when it gets bigger is usually a challenge. Also, there are some methods of structuring the unstructured part of the qualitative data using different types of tools. The methods or the methodologies we use collecting qualitative data, as you see it in there, that you can do the one-to-one interview or a focus group discussions. Focus group discussions are groups of similar knowledge or similar information about a specific topic gathering together. usually the smaller the better. In the industry suggests the maximum 10 to 12, but usually it's preferred to have 5 or 6 people, and then finding information about certain topic. And that usually, as it is very hard to document, you always need some tape recorder, some videotaping, some documentation, a well prepared documentation. So focus group discussion is one of the very important tools of a qualitative data gathering. The other ones are case studies, observations. The observations are in some cases that if you provide training to, let's say that to health professionals in different communities, you just join when the routine activities are happening, of course, by getting a permission to the beneficiaries, and then observing whether the training provided to the service provider is well utilized. So observation is very important. Another very important tool is that there is something called most significant change tool. This usually involves communities or members of communities, and then it's very much participatory, making sure that from this project or from a project which has happening, which one is the most significant in making a difference to the beneficiaries, to the children, to the communities. And then the community's participation is very important in identifying and distilling the most out of the money, because within one project, you might end up having so many different goals or so many different outcomes. But which one is the most significant, which you want to document or which you want to show or to showcase to other stakeholders, to other communities, or in case you want to expand to other parts of the communities. So it's mainly, as I said, that it is about cases, texts, and then audio and then videos, image and symbols are involved in this thing in there.
So Wilson, just if I could interject,
Yes.
a couple of things very interesting in that. One was, I recall on one assignment, you had raised this very important question when you were talking about qualitative and quantitative data, merging of the two. Mm. You can have data, raw data, you can have your baseline data, you can have your midline and your end line, and you can compare it. But at the end of the day, you know, data is very sterile, right? It's a very neutral thing sometimes. Yes. So you raised the question, so what? And that always stuck with me, and it is enriched. I think the answer to that is enriched by the qualitative analysis. Absolutely. That you see the data, but then you go further to talk to the stakeholders of different groups and ask them, you know, what does this mean? What does this data mean? And that's the so what part of that. Yes. And the other thing I'll just point out is that as you're describing these different tools and that, which are very, very important, keep in mind that as a project manager, it costs money.
Exactly.
So, yeah. So maybe that's something to keep in mind. The more complex your analysis and your tools and data collection methods, the more expensive it is. And sometimes you're restricted. So
exactly. Yeah. Exactly. I think you're absolutely right. You remind me of that experience we had. Monitoring data flows into implementing organizations, partners, and then donors. But let's say that the reason we started to put together both the monitoring, the qualitative and the quantitative, is that we received quarterly information saying that 10 teachers were trained on inclusive teaching methodologies. While that is just reported, we plan, let's say 11, 10 of them trained. That is just a very quantitative information we received, but we don't know what happened to those teachers. So a quarter passed or 2 quarters passed, as Phil said that, and then we questioned to report the so what report. So those 10 teachers, what are they doing? Can you answer? So what happens because of that training? What is that we want to see is that there is a reason for training those teachers. The reason is that to make sure that those teachers are applying what they learn on inclusive teaching methodologies, There are, in these different parts of the world, there are different people with different background. There are different people with different ability and then disability. And then how are they accommodating those teachers? And then we start to get a report on that so what report. So the so what report, as Phil said, that it accommodates the qualitative part of it, where justifying the training of that thing in there. Now, as I said earlier, that if nothing happens, if none of those teachers are training, that are not applying what they trained for, or nothing is happening, then this is the beauty of the monitoring part. Then a corrective measure or a follow-up or a supportive supervision, as I said, will be followed on that. Thanks, Phil. And then what you see in front of you here is that some organization, depending on, again, on the budget, Phil, I think he hit the nail on the head, that always there is some component of the monitoring and evaluation which is restrictive. That is resources, mainly the budget. Hoping that there is a budget, there are some organizations which are using an active dashboard. That means decision makers see what is very important to them in real time, based on very selected indicators. What is going up, what is going down, how many we are training, how many have we planned, and then how many we have achieved. So that means there is no back and forth. That is if the resources and the technology allows, because it's not happening in most organizations yet, at least from my experience. Now, jumping to the evaluation part, monitoring and evaluation, as I said earlier, it's not an end goal, but rather it's a means by which we achieve our development outcomes more effectively. So even though that monitoring is a routine, but evaluation happens on a certain period of time. I am talking about the major evaluation in here. Evaluation answers specific questions. What have we achieved, or what kind of impact have we had? This is a very, or where are we? At what point are we in here? Evaluations differs from monitoring, from what I said earlier. Again, I'm talking about a major evaluation on the timing, on the focus, on how detailed it is. If we discuss about the timing, major evaluations like the baseline evaluation, the midline evaluations, and then the endline evaluations is as the name suggests, is happening within those 3 periods. The baseline is happening at time 0 when we are starting the project, and the midline is happening somewhere else in between, and then the end line is happening during the closure, as I said, in the project life cycle at the beginning. So it is very specific in there. And it focuses on outcome rather than an output. We will talk about the difference between outcome and output when we most probably talk about the framework, sometimes at some point. That means the completion of activity is reported on monitoring. But the fact what that activity is going to bring about, which is the outcome, is going to be, should be reflected or should be looked at when we are doing the evaluation. The level of detail is that evaluation is more detailed. It asks the why, the how questions, and then it involves so many of those tools and so many of those planning documents, so many of those hypotheses, assumptions we made at the beginning of the project. All those has to be taken into consideration when we are doing the evaluation. So as I said again, that this is about finding the outcome or the objective of the project. As you see it in there, that there are 2 types of evaluations, as the name suggests, formative evaluation and the summative evaluations. The formative evaluation is something which is happening while the project is going. Midline evaluation is a formative evaluation. It is usually used to make some corrective or some kind of improvement on the progress of the project. The same thing with the baseline can be taken as a formative evaluations. It incorporates lessons. It answers a lot of unanswered questions. When you do the summative evaluations, it is about judgment. It is about the final judgment. It's about, well, in both cases, there is a lesson to be learned, but it is about the effectiveness of the project or the program. Both of these, whether you're doing formative evaluations and then summative evaluation, is a very expensive endeavor for projects or for implementing organizations or for donors. So it is very important to make sure we have that different in mind. So here are the major differences between, again, the monitoring and then the evaluation component. As you can see it in there, what monitoring is asking. Monitoring is about we doing the right thing. As I said earlier, it's routine, it's happening frequently. As I said again, it focus on completion of activities. And again, the other side, the evaluation is the effectiveness of the project. It's periodic, it doesn't happen frequently, and it is more or less on results and outcomes. There are some cases that some evaluations, most probably in some cases, could be about collecting stories. As I said, I don't know if you remember at some point, the most significant change in methodology is usually used as an evaluation tools because that is about collecting stories. Because in some cases that numbers do not make that sense. There were 10%, now they are 100%. Well, that is fine, but it is good to have the story of a person, the story of a child, the story of a mother, the story of a community. So evaluation more or less is about telling that part of the story. Now, so let's see. Here are I don't know. You don't have to say it, but you can just keep it in your mind or for yourself, and then see if you can identify whether what is in there is a monitoring or evaluations. A monitoring and evaluation manager provided a report on the number of teachers trained on inclusive education methodology. I think I mentioned this an earlier example. And this is, of course, it's a monitoring. A study was conducted to find out the result of multiple distribution of nutritional support, food or supplements to young children, and then training also provided to parents. And yeah, because this is to find out whether those training which was provided to mothers and then the food and the nutritional support to children will make a difference or has some kind of result on the community. So what we are doing in here is it's an evaluation. Again, similar to most probably what I mentioned earlier, quarterly local partners in countries reported the number of classrooms renovated or built. This is something which happens routinely. So if it is routine, then there is more monitoring in there. And your donors or a donors of a project, he wants to know how many student beneficiaries received school supplies. Again, this is a completion of an activity. Again, this is a monitoring part. So by just looking at some of the activities or what you want to do, you can identify whether what you want to do is a monitoring or an evaluation.
I just have a quick question.
Sure, go ahead.
So since we've compared and the contrasts and differences between monitoring and evaluation, can we then assume, although they're both different, that they're both equally important?
Yes.
Yes, okay.
They are both equally important. As I said, there are two faces of a coin. For example, in so many of those evaluations, the monitoring part becomes an input, an input. In so many of those evaluation results, let's say that if we have a midterm evaluation, that is something which happened in the middle of a project, if certain things is not happening, we're going to make a change in what we are doing routinely. So one complements the other one, or one cannot live without the other one. So that is why we always say that monitoring and evaluation. And then some people, knowingly or unknowingly, use both words interchangeably. But yes, they have some difference, but they need each other very much.
Yes.
Thank
Okay.
you. It was an excellent question. Okay, let me go back to my, okay. So, by the way, I'm not sure because I have a mix up in here with my slide. Evaluation can be conducted internally and then by external resources. Before I reach in here, evaluation can be done by internal and then external resources. Monitoring most of the time, 99.9%, use an internal staff, which is doing, because this is a routine activity, whether it is stationed within implementing partners or within the communities. But evaluation usually needs an external or internal evaluations. You do internal evaluations, or you use your internal resources to do evaluations. One is very important, as Phil earlier mentioned, is resources, lack of resources, lack of budget. So we usually use internal resources, or the evaluation is not that much big. So in that case, we use internal resources, and then whatever is coming out of that study want to be integrated into what we are doing internally as well. In addition, there is an advantage that by doing internally, we are building the skills of the staff or the resources we have within the organizations. When we use an external evaluators, again, this costs a lot of money. It's one of the biggest budget of the monitoring evaluation in here. Yes, you're going to have a different perspective by bringing external resources. But again, as I said, that yes, different perspective. And in some cases that external evaluators are a request by the donors. You don't have any choice. You don't have any choice. External donors most probably wants to find different perspectives. So they suggest, or you are pushed to have your evaluation done by external resources. So these are very important things to take a note when think about evaluations.
One thing as well was, and I would add to that,
Yeah.
in the event that donors are not pushing you for an external evaluator because of the cost,
Yes.
you usually are doing it internally, as Wosan has said. One of the areas that you have to juggle sometimes, and I'm always advising organizations on this, is if you do an external evaluation with a very reputable organization or reputable consultant, it does lend a certain credibility to your project as well, depending who's evaluating it. It's a bit like, you know, the difference between a university giving you guys grades or you grading yourself. How well did I do? So if it's a self-report of your grade, sometimes, you know, to external audiences, it doesn't carry the same weight as university saying, this is what you got. So it's a very similar thing.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. By the way, is there a break you're taking now, Phil, or how does I forgot?
No, not just yet. I think we'll just keep going, Wosan, and you know, if somebody wants a break, put up your hand, start waving. But I think we're okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay. There's one very important tool in monitoring and evaluations, and that is something called the monitoring and evaluation plan. The monitoring and evaluation plan document puts everything together about monitoring and evaluations. It's a document. It integrates the monitoring and evaluation document. It is a living document. When I mean by living document, it is something which you have to update from time to time, depending on your finding, depending on your experience, depending on your partners or stakeholders' experience. So you have to put in detail your whole monitoring and evaluation system that will be used to measure your project activities. And there are some cases where donors provide the monitoring and evaluation plan templates, which you have to complete that. But in most cases, that organizations has to come up with their own monitoring and evaluation plan during the initiation period of the project. This is not something you do sometimes in between or at the end. So this is something you do at the beginning of the project, because all those things, what you are monitoring, what you are evaluating, what kind of indicators you're using, what is your framework, all these things are identified, and then those will be put in there. I have a document, I don't know, have you shared, or I think I have to show it in here, that document. I have a template to show.
Yeah, go ahead and share it in there. I didn't put it up on Moodle, so.
Okay, let me see. Okay, it is a Word document which I take credit to an organization called Tool for Development. They have so many of these M&E related different tools. So this is a template which I find in there. As you see that, it looks like that it's an organization. It's a very important document with everything has to be in place. The way I see that, this is in most cases that it might be different from organization to organizations. So you might see something different in some, you might see more or less in another one. So the content of this document in here is that, well, I'm going to go to the table of contents in there. Instead of the table of contents, I'm going to go to each part in there. Of course, the acronym is always in there. The introduction. This is about the reason having the monitoring and evaluation part, the plan, and then what the objective is. Who are the users or the audiences to utilize this in here? When was this documented? How often do you think that this will be revised or looked at? And then things like that will be in here. And the next, which is something good to have, is that a summary of about the project, because if there are 2 or 3 projects which are in some cases different or funded by same or different funders, you might end up developing that many of this project, this monitoring and evaluation plan, because each and every donor has a different requirement. Each and every project have different objectives and goals. So depending on the number of project you have, you might end up developing as many of them in here. So this is a project summary, the title, the starting date of the project, partners who are involved in there, the target or the community you'll be implementing, beneficiaries. So this is almost similar to what you have it in your proposal, the way I see it. It's not, you're not creating anything new, you're just putting things together from different places and then make it handy to monitoring and evaluation or decision makers in there. Who are the beneficiaries? The cost of the project, the total cost, not the monitoring and evaluation part in here. Who are the funders and or the funding source, and then the goal of the project. Usually these are 1 or 2 statements, because there is always a bigger document within the organizations. The logical framework is something which we'll be talking about in a couple of weeks or whatever, right? I feel suggested in there. This is a framework which is a very important component of the monitoring and evaluations. So it specifies the goal, output, and then outcome, and then we'll come in detail to that. Indicators, the one I mentioned in the monitoring part, these are the markers of each and every activity. Each and every marker's activity has to be defined. And most probably this is part of the framework when we are going to discuss sometimes in the future as well. But just to show you one example in here, if you have an indicator, like you have to specify what that indicator is. For example, one indicator could be number of teachers trained, or number of students who received school supplies, it could be that. And then you have to define what that means. Why is that important? Defining indicator is very important because you have to standardize that, and then you have to make sure there is an understanding between communities. And this document also shared to your stakeholders. If one community understands teachers, only those teachers who has a license to teach or does not include, let's say, support, teacher supports or tutorials or what have you, most probably that's going to underestimate the achievement. So having a definition of your indicator is very important. The purpose of that indicator. Usually monitoring values are 0, but in this case, if it is about monitoring, you put the initial number or the initial value you have, and then what you're trying to achieve by the year end. What are the data collection method? What kind of tool or spreadsheet or template you will be using? How often you will be collecting these indicators? Who's responsible to collect these indicators? And the reporting mechanism. How do you assure data quality? And then how often do you do that? So all these things will be specified about each and every indicator. You might have 10 indicators. That means you're going to have 10 of these detailed informations about each and every one of them. And here is another one. There's no point of this one. This is just a template. And roles and responsibilities of the M&E component in there. You might have, as I said again, you might have monitoring and evaluation human resources at the implementer, with the implementer, or if you don't have that, you might have another one at the community level, at the partners level. In some cases, that monitoring and evaluation is done with another stakeholders within the same country. It could be within Canada. So each and every role which is related to the monitoring and evaluation component has to be specified, and then what his responsibility or his or her responsibility is within that role. Again, it doesn't have to say monitoring and evaluation officer or whatever. It could be a program manager who is doing this job. So his role has to be defined in here. How is the data flowing? You have to make sure that this understanding is in there, because there is a big turnover in some organizations, making sure that there is an understanding that the data flows from the community all the way to the donor. It's always good to show how often it's going, who is responsible to what. So this flow chart is showing the that information. So it's also good to have that within that document in there. The data management. Now, once the monitoring information or the base or the evaluation part comes, where are you storing it? At different levels. At community levels, where is it storing? At the stakeholders levels, where is it storing? At implementing partners, where is it storing? What kind of storage or what kind of technology are you using? Are you using hard copy, soft copy? So all those has to be done. Analysis. How often is analysis done? And then who is doing the analysis? And what kind of tools you will be using? There are a statistical package for social science. SPSS is used. These days there is Microsoft BI is in there. There is Tableau. There are different applications who are doing analytics these days. Fantastic analytics tools in there. Another very important is privacy. We have to assure privacy of the data we are collecting, because in some organizations we are collecting lots of personal information, children's address in some cases, some personal information. So we have to make sure it's very important how that information, how that privacy is secured within an organization. Organization in most cases has organization-wide privacy. It is possible to adapt that policy in making sure that any information about our beneficiaries, children's, and whether it's children or adult, has to have that policy in place. So all those things are to be mentioned in here. And additional appendices always is in there. As I said again, this is just for one organization. This is just a suggestion. It is possible that there might be some, depending on the organization, some additional information which are in place in here.
So I imagine, Wosan, just on the privacy issue, that the type of technology that's being used, especially today, because we have such modern tools to actually
Yes.
collect data through handheld devices and that, how the data is stored, as you mentioned, but also how data is transferred between
Yes.
people, so that if it's soft copies especially, can it be hacked? Can it fall into the wrong hands? Are there GPS aspects of it, you know, so that people can identify where children live in villages, for example?
Yes.
All
Yes.
of that, I guess, has to be carefully assessed, doesn't it, and secured.
That's true. That is true. All those has to be looked at, and then one way of making sure is that making sure that there is a policy in place where everybody is looking at, or everybody has to comply with. So it's very important too. So that is about the monitoring and evaluation plan. And then, as I said again, it's not something which you create from scratch. It is a document which puts everything together. And then what you see in front in here is just the introduction part of in there. There are certain things from my experience which also put in there. For example, that you might have some activity, some work plan, some work which you need to plan them quarterly or annually for those who are in charge. So you might need to list those activity and then who is responsible, what the indicators are, and then the time frame within that plan as well. So this is just an additional suggestions. So going back in general, when you look at the monitoring and evaluation component, we looked at what monitoring is, we looked at what evaluation is, and then we looked at the plan which is putting together. And then when we put all those together, it gives you in general that the system, the monitoring and evaluation system, and it's something, the system is not necessarily only a computer system. It's just that this putting all these things together. So you have to have the human capacity for monitoring and evaluations. You have to have a monitoring and evaluation partnership. I think I forgot to mention, I think Phil also, in most cases, that he also suggested to make sure that we have some kind of peer evaluators, similar organization looking at our system and then what they think they are from their experience. What do they think about ours? What do they have within their organization? So peer review is very important. So that is the one which it deals with monitoring and evaluation partnership. It's good to have a monitoring and partnership workshop or some work group. I mean work group. And the plan is again part of the monitoring and evaluation system. A database is very good and very important. Structure within the with monitoring and evaluation. You have to have a structure with monitoring and evaluation, how it is flowing, or if there are different layers of monitoring and evaluations, if it is at the director level, at manager level, data collectors, data encoders, all those has to be put in place. By the end of the day, the monitoring and evaluation system is about dissemination and data use. If anybody is not using that for decision making, for day-to-day management, then it is useless. So taking that into perspective, that it is about dissemination, it is about using. The systems are, at least at the minimum, the monitoring and evaluation plan, the monitoring and evaluation database, the structure, the human capacity, and the partnership. Now I'm going to jump to a knowledge management component in here. And there are so many of these different definitions about knowledge management. I just put a couple of them. I mean, if you Google them, you might have to find different depending on the context. But from my side, I said the word knowledge management actually enriches monitoring and evaluation. It takes it to the higher level, monitoring and evaluation. Knowledge, or the fact that accepting knowledge is actually a resource, it's an input for the organizations. It's very much important or necessary for the success of the organization objective. It has value. The fact that you know how things are being done, the fact that you document how things are happened, what your experience are, what you're sharing, everything has a value. It's an organizational asset. The fact that putting together the monitoring and evaluation component and then treating it as a knowledge is very important, and it's an organizational asset. Knowledge management involves creating and then sharing information or the knowledge using different platforms or different forms. And it's a different and important and a big task. The knowledge management, in my experience, is, even though it was around for a very long time, it gets much focus. It makes much focus because of, I think the way I see it, because of three different reasons. One is that because of the globalizations of business these days, organizations or organizations these days are very global. They are very multi-use. They are very multilingual, multicultural in nature. So knowledge is an asset. So that globalizations demands knowledge, and then the fact that having that asset is become very important. The other one is organization amnesia. That means that the fact that if we don't document, if we don't take this knowledge as an asset, we forget about it. And then we're not building from that on the next project, especially when we're going to the same community again, or another implementer goes to the community which we worked before. So in order to avoid that amnesia, as a workforce or as an implementer or as a donor, it's good to have that organization knowledge management system within our organizations and then treat it as an organization asset. The other one, which I believe is very important, or which contributes to this knowledge management, is that technology advances. The fact that the technology is advanced and then making things easier to share, to store, to do analytics, to do this and that, makes it very appropriate to introduce this thing at the forefront of monitoring and evaluation. So the process of this, generating this new knowledge, capturing, organizing existing knowledge, or adapting knowledge and sharing, it always involves something within the organization. And that involvement, that involves data, it involves information, and then it involves knowledge. And then as you see it in there, we see it, even I myself are using it interchangeably. There is a difference between data and information. Data is a raw data which we collected, and then as you see it in there, information it's an aggregated or processed data. And knowledge actually is derived from that information. It has to be analyzed. There has to be an analytics part of it, and that is where the technology is playing a very, very important role in there. And then somehow the information changing to knowledge, we have the ability to make sound decision based on that knowledge. Knowledge sharing these days, again, this knowledge management takes monitoring and evaluation into a higher level, as I said in there, because as you see it earlier, the data which is collected with monitoring or evaluations is changed into information using analytics or analytics applications. And then that information changed into knowledge, which leads for a better decision making. So knowledge sharing and learning is very important. So usually the platform usually use the platform in some cases that they use web-based sharing. Microsoft SharePoint in some organizations is very much utilized to share information internally and then externally as well. And then the network of partnership is also very important. By sharing it online or offline. The online, as you see it in there, is that you might end up publishing this knowledge, infographic, through discussion or meetings, through webinars, seminars, or things like that. We'll do the appropriate information sharing in there. As I said again, it takes the knowledge management component, takes monitoring and evaluation into the next level, to a higher level. So there have some complementary characteristics in there. While one translates information across and then the other one provide guidance. When one develops structures and then the other one identify credible indicators, which is monitoring and evaluations. And then when one advocates M&E and then the other one includes knowledge management in the planning and in the planning process in there. Okay. Something which I think missed putting there is that the knowledge management always involves, as I said again, that it involves people, it involves technology, and then there is a process within that which makes the life easier. There are two types of knowledge. I don't know if you experience in there, which organizations are building on. These are, one is what they call explicit knowledge. This is something which you can document on, or which you can have, you can store it, you can process it, you can present it, you can capture it. This is what explicit kind of knowledge. And the other one is tacit knowledge, which you have an experience. You cannot show it in words or say it. It resides within you, but it's the experience which you have to share with other as necessary. It's an organization asset which you cannot put into a documentation. So both this tacit and then explicit knowledge is very important to have a knowledge management system in there. Any question in there? Okay. The automating or technology plays a greater role in data collections these days, especially. Most implementing organizations are always struggling to have a viable and a standardized system. I think Phil mentioned it at the beginning in here. Because of the fact that different organizations are doing different things, it's becoming very difficult in some cases to standardize. Though that so many of these applications or data management tools are developed, still there is no one fit all system which you can just pick or buy and then use it for monitoring and evaluations. Most of them needs to be customized for your own usage, whether you are going to store it or whether you're going to do its analysis or whether you're going to do it for reporting purposes. So there is no one fit all system in there. But there is one beauty things which is happening these days by most organizations, that is digitizing the data collection part. These days, the mobile phone, the iPad is becoming a data collection tool in a remote area of most countries these days, because the tools or the apps developed based on a questionnaire is working online and then offline. That means that you can collect your information by going to a remote area where they do not have an internet, and then you go back to a place and then you collect your data from that area. And when you go back to your office where you have an internet connections, it immediately updates that data you collected from the community level. So there are these, which is, I think most organizations are using these days, because developing that application is also becoming easy. You do not need to know programming language. It's a drag and drop application development. Some of the ones which I am aware of are some of them you see online and offline. Fulcrum, Comcare, and the Dimagis are the ones which I am aware of. And then I'm sure that there are so many of them. If you look at all those three of them, if you get a chance, you know one, you know it all. They are just straightforward and nothing much on that part. Well, monitoring and evaluations as a discipline or as a position within organization is being called in different names. So you do not see, when organizations are looking for monitoring and evaluation, in most cases they might not say monitoring and evaluation. There are some they call planning and monitoring and evaluation. Some even call it straight monitoring and knowledge management officer or knowledge management director or project officer. Some call it design because you are part of the design. So the title reflects that you are part of the design part. Some says design, implementation, and monitoring and evaluation. This is they're just telling you if what we discussed about in the project life cycle, that you are being part of it. Some shows that the learning component, and then some shows the knowledge management component. So it is being named and renamed in different ways, but it always ends up doing the monitoring and evaluation and the knowledge management component part. I think most probably I'm on the last slide. And one thing I have to emphasize in monitoring and evaluation in there, even as a title, is you have to emphasize the participatory part of it. If you do not have a participatory monitoring and evaluation or even knowledge management, it's not going to be functional at all. It's not going to be functional at all. Donors has to be involved, the community has to be involved, field staff has to be involved, and national government all has to be involved from the, if we want to get an appropriate information from the beginning to the end. There are, from my experience, that at some point in the earlier period, monitoring and evaluation was perceived as a donor requirement. When the donor is not requesting, some organization most probably used to skip this part. But starting in the middle is usually very hard. But still, at which point you start, you have to make sure that you involve all stakeholders within the intervention, all partners within the organizations and in the staff as well. And finally, let me share one experience I have. I'm sure that I have time, right, Phil? Okay, great. There was, let's say that there was this organizations that just as a question there as well, that they did an evaluations, baseline evaluation. A baseline evaluation, as I said earlier, is an evaluations where you have to find out where you are at the beginning of the project. Because when the donor gives you the financing, they give you to make a difference. They give you that financing because you told them that there is a gap and there is a gap to be filled. But there was a baseline assessment which I encountered that an organization done that baseline assessment and it was shelved. And some point at the end of the project, we needed to see the baseline value so that we can have a comparison. Midline was not conducted because it was a short period of intervention. So when we look at that baseline information, all those indicators about the project are in the 90 and the 95 percentiles. What is that we do when we encountered such a case? That means that we wrote a proposal. We mentioned that there is a gap within the community, and then we have to fill that gap, or we have to support that community. We build the capacity, and during initiation period, we gave it to external resources or to somebody else to do the baseline assessment based on a predefined indicators. And then the baseline assessment was conducted, value was assigned, and the document was shelved, and nobody looked at it. But when somebody joined the organizations and then start to look back, the baseline value, all baseline values were 90 and then above. There is a challenge in here, right? There is a challenge. The challenge is that, why do we need the intervention? We do not need the intervention if the initial value or the initial value of those outcomes we want to achieve. For example, that we want to reduce the HIV prevalence. It's already maybe close to zero, let's say that. We want to make sure that capacity, the use livelihood or the workforce of youth has increased, but the baseline value told you that already youth are employed and 95–96% of the youth are employed. Then what is that we do? See, this is a dilemma where in real time, in real life experience, sometimes which happens, especially as I said at some point that there are cases that where there is a high turnover of staff, whether it's at the community level or at the implementer level, or there is always a possibility where that monitoring and evaluation is not taken seriously or is not taken as a management tool. And then that happens because they have not looked at that document. So this is a challenge which at some point we face from my experience. This is actually, I faced this experience. So anyways, to give you the solution which we went through is that we have to throw out that baseline value. Because that baseline value was financed by the implementing organizations and it's conducted by external person. There is a disadvantage of some doing that with external person is that external person or that external, once they've done that evaluation, they're not anywhere most probably to be found or to justify that information. So one very important tip is that if you give it to external evaluators, make sure that there is a sound evaluators or an evaluators which you can at some point in the future can be communicated and then justified or give more insight to what has been done in the previous time. So the solution we provide is that by throwing out that baseline formation and look for national level or international level comparison indicator values. Yeah. That means we looked at to that community. If you don't have community, we looked at the national level indicator values, similar values, to take it as a baseline for a specific year or prior years. And then in most cases, we got lucky to get from other implementing organizations or local government places to give us that value so that we get a chance to compare it and then showcase the achievement of the organization.
So Wilson, maybe I can just maybe take that scenario you've painted for us and just throw it out to the class.
Yes.
And ask the question, how could you see that scenario playing out? Like, how would that actually happen? Because it does happen more often than we like to think. that, you know, a request is made because there's a perceived gap, and then you do the baseline, and then you find, oops. Why do you think we get into that situation? Anyone want to take a guess at why that could happen? How does an agency get to the place where it goes to a donor and says, we need money for this particular group for this activity, and then, okay, do the baseline, and they do the baseline and find, oops, actually, there's no need there at all.
There's no gap.
No gap.
I mean, this could be wrong, but one reason could potentially be that through some level of the process of monitoring or evaluation, maybe some of the statistics or information or data was wrong. So they actually thought that there was a need in a certain area that money needed to be put towards. And in the end, they find out, oh, that actually wasn't an area that we needed to put it in. I don't know if that would be a reason, but.
Yeah, I mean, it could be. It definitely could be. I think Woson would be the first to say, you know, that we've made mistakes at times.
Yes.
Sometimes. Yeah, so I think that's a valid possibility. Yeah.
True. That is true.
Anyone else want to take a stab at something else? I mean, there's a whole possible ream of things that could have happened, but.
Yes. Yeah. I think you have to look at from different perspectives. Yes, the wrong part is in there as well. The fact that not taking seriously or not looking at it, as I said earlier, it could have been caught earlier.
Sorry, I just have a question that kind of connects to this.
Yes.
From either of your experiences working in the field, I know that you mentioned that the monitoring and evaluation has to be participatory in order for it to become successful in work, which makes sense. But I'm just wondering, from either of your experiences, have you found that specifically NGOs or organizations have cut corners in terms of monitoring and evaluation, either due to they didn't have enough resources or finances, and because of that, corners have been cut in terms of monitoring and evaluation? Maybe that could also lead to a lack of data or miscommunication.
Yeah, Wilson.
Yes.
Sorry. Short, I guess to put it short, is it common from either of your experiences that you found that NGOs cut corners on monitoring and evaluation due to financial reasons?
Well, not really, not to my experience, because most of my experience worked with the bigger donors like the GAC, the Global Affairs Canada, or the USAID, or WHO, or UNICEF. And then these organizations make it a requirement to make sure that you have monitoring and evaluations at different levels. And then when they require, it is your duty to negotiate, to make sure that there is resources to make sure that that thing happens without cutting any corners. So it is about planning. It is make sure that you have a strong negotiation at the beginning, or at the beginning of the project, and making sure that you have enough resources in monitoring and evaluation at all levels. Now, the challenge, most probably from my experience, maybe not cutting corners, but motivation at the lower level is a problem. Motivation of community or members of the community to report, because and that shows sometimes in the quality of information you are getting. Because in some cases, this is just a volunteer job when it goes to community, and then when you ask them to report data monthly, quarterly, or whatever. So you might have to make sure that you give some kind of incentive by inviting them to trainings, or by giving them certificate, acknowledgement, or things like that. So not really, from my experience, those funders which I'm involved with, the big ones, are part of a requirement and a part of the planning, and then part of the financing, and then a strong implementing organization always, if it is a donor requirement, then a budget better be on it. And then, as I said again, there are times where there is a budget cut at some point in the middle or whatever. When that happens, yes, there is going to be a shifting. Instead of using an external evaluator, uses internal evaluator. There are times which I involve going from here from Canada to to be part of an evaluation in Africa or in the Asia part to support and in order to save money. And then these days, as I said earlier, the technology is making it easier. The fact that we are having a handheld digitized data collection tool avoid data entry cost for so many organizations, because when you are collecting the data, you are also doing data entry. In the previous time, there were two different costs to do data collection. The data collection, they do it paper-based, and then that paper-based has to be entered with data collection people, and the data collection people has to be trained, and then you have to have the right technology in order to do the data entry as well. So there is the technology also supported this point.
Another way to look at that question too, Rebecca, is that if we respect the process, the due process and methodologies in project management and follow the proper sequence, you should not get into that situation where you're cutting corners or where you're getting inferior inputs. So if you're hiring, you're following the process, you're hiring competent M&E officers in the field, you should arrive at your solution. Where people go off track, I think, a lot of NGOs in particular, and smaller ones too, is they have this perception that there is a need in a community and they have specialized skills in certain areas. So maybe they're very good at training mothers in child rearing, or they're very good at training teachers. And so they'll continue in that community for years and years and years, and always assume, because it's a developing community, that there is always a need. And at some point, there won't be that need anymore if they've done their job. I mean, you're supposed to be sustainable and get out. That's the objective. So they'll have this combined thing of saying, this perception of saying, there is a need, that's always going to be there, and we're good at doing this. So they'll immediately submit to a donor and say, yeah, we should train mothers in this and train teachers in this. And then they hire a competent M&E manager who comes in and goes, guys, you've met your targets. You can't go from 95 to 100. That doesn't happen.
Yeah.
So I find that happens quite a bit.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. That's true. Yeah, so I think that's what I have for the day. If you have questions, I'll be happy to answer it. Hope I make sense, and you can ask at any point.
Well, Wilson, I really want to thank you. And what we've been hearing about from you are really the components of those key processes I just mentioned of project management. There are things like information management, risk management, scope management, quality management. There's 9 of them actually in total. And over the next several weeks, I'm going to be building up to that. Keep the suspense until I bring that all together. Nice. And as I do, hopefully you'll be primed, because you'll have heard some of these components and you'll understand how they fit together as a management methodology. I think for me, what's really important to remember from what you've been speaking about, Wilson, is that M&E is not meant to be a policing process. And some people think it is. They're scared of M&E. Some people I've met are actually really scared of it. Yeah. But it's a tool. And for a manager, for you as a project manager getting ready to go out to the field, it can be very formative, and it can help you make decisions. If you use it correctly, you can make those decisions as a project manager. That's why I said earlier, I really lean and depend on my M&E manager, because they're an extremely important position. And it's a way to report back to donors as well that we're spending their money properly, builds confidence, gives credibility to you and to your organization. And it gives us that method to make those corrective changes along the way. That's why it's formative, so that we arrive at our planned results. And I think what you mentioned too, Wilson, about telling a story that will help, it also helps leverage our support and our donors for the project as well when we tell that story well. And I love your expression actually of saying, I don't think I've heard you say it before, but maybe you have and I wasn't listening, but saying that knowledge is an organizational asset. Yes. is incredibly important to put it that way. That's positioning it beautifully, because it is proprietary information and data for an organization, and it actually creates our competitive edge in the sector. That information. So it's really proprietary. You don't want to give that up. But it also builds excellence in our practices and gives us some platform for sharing as well with others. Yeah. So thank you for those points. It's really important. I'd like to ask if anyone else, rather than go to a break, because it's sort of hot now, do you have any other questions? Because then we don't have to hold Wilson over the break. And keep him any longer than necessary. But do you have any other questions you'd like to ask him before he goes? Or anything that didn't quite make
Anything
sense?
about, yeah.
Don't be shy. He's one of the best in his field, guys, so take the time. He usually charges a lot for this.
Exactly.
Free, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, well, if not, I just I just want to say how much I appreciate you being on, Wosen, and giving us your time. And I know during this time of COVID, M&E is not an easy thing to do.
That's true.
And I find that, agencies are really struggling now because M&E really is a hands-on, you heard him say many times, that it's really an encounter with the stakeholders, face-to-face with communities and so on. So during COVID, this is really going to be proving to be a very difficult task. So you can imagine for projects around the world, this is probably one area that has got people very concerned about sustainability and success rates in projects. So all of this really excellent, Wilson, and I'm sure it's beneficial for all of us. Broaden our learning, and thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you. Thank you.
Great. And we'll
Bye-bye.
talk soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.
And I'm going to give everyone I know you're probably tired. We've gone for a while, guys. Can I ask that we take maybe 5 or 6 minutes? Is that okay? Just for a quick health break, and then we'll come back and just wrap up. All righty? Fantastic. Okay, 5 minutes, and I'll see you back here. So in 2017, the UN set a resolution that reiterated that this important role and specified that governments are important to achieving the SDGs by identifying and updating their policies, their strategies for development, their various institutions, building capacity, and how they monitor the progress of the SDGs in country. So at every level, the local government authorities were stated as being extremely important throughout the process. So even as Wilson mentioned, they're an important stakeholder that have to continually be involved in your work. So like local government here in Canada, it's the level where you see, let's say, how to define it. I guess it's where the localization exists for the delivery of basic services throughout the community. So let's say that that's a basic definition of local authority. So they implement according to the practices that are set by the regional or national government bodies, and they implement based on the resources that are allocated to them to then reallocate to community activities. So these government bodies are also sometimes called subnational authorities, or they might be called local government. You'll hear different names for it. And the various level of government in every country, if it's functioning well, they'll be examining the current capacity they have to address things like the SDGs and development projects, and they'll look at what investments they need to advance them further. So that's their responsibility. So another area we also have to be really vigilant about, keeping in mind vanity projects and high visibility and tangible infrastructure, obviously is king in these things. Governments will naturally have competing priorities of their own as well. So for example, they'll be tempted to ignore new targets that are very difficult to define. So if there are indicators around what I shared when we were talking about the SDGs on child fair chance, I mentioned that's something very new that's been introduced. That's something that they may deprioritize. They may not focus on as much as the much more visible ones where, you can guess education and health is extremely visible in the world today and everyone's talking about it. So they lean towards the goals that are easier, more visible. They'll attract more funding from donors. So our job when we're in the charity sector and doing these projects is to provide a sort of oversight and a watchdog function to ensure the gaps are filled and that no one's left behind as these priorities start to shift in the country. And sometimes that means developing structures for monitoring and evaluation. So charities can actually have a really important function in contributing to local governments in how they develop their data, collect the data, analyze it, and report it back to the national government. So there's all sorts of different areas that we can fit in. Now, what I'd like to do is shift focus and get ourselves a little bit more positioned for our discussion next week, where we're going to be hearing from another specialist who's this time based in Bangladesh. So fingers crossed that Zoom works, because sometimes the connections are not great. But in addition to looking at community mapping and stakeholder analysis, I've asked him to do a preliminary introduction to the concept of the universal logic model concept, this universal logic model that even Mohsen mentioned, and the project cycle, which I referred to last week, as it is impacted by monitoring, evaluation, and learning, so MEL. And you'll recall what Wilson said, there's like 5 or 6 ways of defining monitoring and evaluation. MEL is one of those. And this specialist is going to be coming on and talking about MEL and how it fits in the life cycle of the project. So we're going to start to get into the science a little bit that I talked about, that 20% science piece of international development, more deeply into the tools and methods we use to manage a project. Now, I believe, let me think, I guess, yeah, you're in 3rd year. So I believe that you'll all be graduating in a couple of years, right? You've got this year and next year?
I'm in my last year.
You're in last, Rebecca? Okay.
I'm in last as well.
Oh, you are? Okay. Okay. So some of you might be going to 4th year, I guess. Are you in a 4th year, Nicholas, and taking a 3rd year course, or?
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, okay. 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 So then let's assume, you know, either you're graduating now or maybe you have another year to get yourself, you know, established into an entry position. I was just kind of taking a ballpark on this. You might get an entry position within an international development agency in a year or so. And you'll notice that most job descriptions require 3 to 5 years of experience for project managers. That's what they'll normally stipulate in the job descriptions. So by the time you decide to go overseas, assuming the pandemic's over, you'll be at least, let's say, 5 to 6 year mark, one would say, from now, before landing, you know, that really exciting first overseas project management job. And fingers crossed, it could be sooner. So in teaching the course from the point of view of a practitioner, I thought it'd be far more valuable experience to share with you the key methodologies and tools you're actually likely to encounter in the field of international development, rather than going into that traditional, remember the project management book of knowledge, that really big book that I showed you, which frankly, most of it you'll never use again, right? Unless you plan to be certified in project management. So I'll first talk about the industry standard. And I mentioned this earlier, Wilson also mentioned it, or the lack thereof. And as you peruse the many hundreds of development agencies looking for that first job, it's unlikely that any of the agencies will admit to you, certainly they won't, that they have poor management techniques, right? I mean, they're very unlikely to hear that from any organization. In fact, it's often the opposite. They'll usually all claim to have the best standards, the best benchmarks, and they'll take great offense at the suggestion of not being at par with the industry. But we know that a lot of them are not. But how do I put this without getting into trouble? You could say, you know, herein lies a challenge of our industry, the international development industry. I'd argue that only a few agencies out there, not to be named, especially in the nonprofit sector, can actually provide evidence that they use any kind of formal project management methodologies, okay? At least not using them consistently and measured in order to prove it. All right, that's a big statement, but I'm saying that they need to have evidence behind them saying we have great standards. So when we hear an agency making those claims, I would ask the first question, what is our industry standard for project management in international development? And I can guarantee very, very few people have asked that question. I'd even challenge you to Google it at some point and see what comes up. And then, do you require, following that question, do you require your project managers to be certified? Okay, so first, what is your standard in the industry? Generally, that's the holistic standard. And then to the agency, do you require your project managers to be certified? Because if there is a standard and an ethical base to which agencies then subscribe, it usually requires certified staff. right? If you have an ethics base and a standard, you normally need somebody to be certified. That's why we get degrees and, you know, get diplomas and certifications and all that sort of thing. And the answer is very simple to that. No. In most social initiatives, or what we would call soft projects, the answer is no. And in most economic or entrepreneurial development projects, a bit more technical in nature, the answer is still almost always no. And again, just look at the job descriptions and what they're asking for. And are any of your regular field staff or your partner staff or your community-based organizations or your local partners certified? Are they certified? Still no. That would be the answer. Sure, if we're building a bridge, you know, or constructing something, a hard, tangible project, but then in that case, we likely will subcontract for a finite period of time, conducting or supervising those activities, but we'll bring in a certified contractor to do that. At least I hope we will, otherwise the bridge would fall down. So that may sound a bit harsh to you, and I'm certainly willing to say that this is my opinion over many, many years in the field, but I know that it's also the opinion of many of my peers. And even if you take a cursory look on Google, you'll see similar statements from the Project Management Institute, researchers, academics. There's lots of articles online about it. And there's certainly an obstacle, I would say, in our industry that's being noticed by people who care and people who are, concerned by it. So it has been noticed. And the thing is, most of the nonprofits and maybe even many of the profit organizations, they don't look for certification in project management development positions. For project managers, let's say they look for the number of years experience that you have. They'll look at the number of countries you've worked in, diversity of the initiatives that you've taken care of, number of staff you've supervised. That's one of the big questions I get asked every single time. How many staff did you supervise? And of course, there'll be the standard reference checks that will check up on those things. And for the small projects, organizations will either repurpose existing staff in their agency because they're too small, their budgets are small, or they'll hire somebody from outside under the previous criteria I just mentioned. And if it's a large project, especially something quite technical that the agency hasn't had a lot of experience with, then you might see them relying on technical skills of their project managers who they bring in. But we call it purchasing expertise, and we refer to them oftentimes, especially in the Christian sector, as technocrats. But even so, they may have experience, but they have very little formal training in project management. And this becomes another problem. We start relying on technical staff who are great in their field, but they haven't got a clue how to manage a project. So, and a vast majority of our people in the field will be repurposed staff from our agency. We take them from a general practitioner position in headquarters, we put them in the field and ask them to run a project. Or people we've brought in to be experts in that particular sector of water and health and infrastructure or whatever. But do they have the wherewithal to manage the processes and the methodology of a project? All of the pieces that we're going to be talking about. In addition, a lot of our managers, project managers, arrive into a context that's very unfamiliar to them. Right? It might be a culture shock going into a different country. And there are all sorts of difficult work conditions. All right, just some of the obvious ones are low pay. You don't get a lot of pay in a nonprofit sector. There's insecurity. A lot of countries have a lot of volatility politically, volatile environments generally, and often there's competing requests and expectations from within the community themselves, and you struggle with that every single day. The satisfaction levels of communities or criticism about the work that you're doing. So it is not an easy task for a project manager. And on top of that, we're often struggling with finding limited goods and services in markets that are deprived. Oftentimes, that's why we're there and that's why we're working. But we can't find what we need in the local markets. We can't access what we need. And in Myanmar, as an example, quite recently, we couldn't even get cash into the country for the work that we were doing. So we ended up, whoever went in had to carry 2 suitcases full of cash that we had taken out from the bank to bring in, because you couldn't transfer cash through the normal systems. So what we tend to see as a result is that the projects will often limp along outside of the starter's gate. Okay, they'll just start limping at the beginning. And we often see projects with slow rates of startup due to slow hiring, obstacles that they encounter, staff conflicts. That's very common as well. There's lots of community issues I mentioned. There's poorly organized or confusing work schedules sometimes, and agency cultural practices and expectations, and many other potential problems that could arise. And then we see things like slow burn rates of budgets, like underspending that grows over time. And this leads to agencies asking their donors to extend their project timelines. And these are called no-cost extensions, or basically extending the project but not increasing the funding. So increasing time, not increasing cost. And in fact, Global Affairs Canada recently stopped allowing all no-cost extensions coming in from implementing agencies because there were just so many requests for people to do it. So again, it goes back to our managing scope, time, and cost, is that basically project managers who are responsible for the projects just were not able to regulate those three factors because of all these other things that I've been mentioning, and therefore go back to the donor and say, cap in hand, hey, we need more time. We can't finish this as expected. And I don't want to blame poor performing project managers for every instance of this. I'm not trying to say that at all. I mean, I'm one of them as well, so I be careful. But it has a roll-on effect on impacting the organization where they finish their planned activities, but they fail to meet their originally planned objectives. So again, the agency starts to look bad as well. So we have a responsibility in that sense. And as such, the higher level outcomes are not achieved from the project. And then this has that roll-on of affecting the bottom line budget of an organization. There's an increase in their exposure, increase in their risk, and eventually it's going to contribute to poor reputation in the implementation of development projects. At that point, you can say donors will stop trusting the organization eventually as well. And I've seen so many examples of that where donors, where agencies just can't access funds from donors because of bad experiences. So all of these things that I've mentioned, I'm going to be talking about in a couple of weeks when we start talking about project management processes, because all of these components are going to take shape within the 9 processes of project management. I'm just planting the seed now in your minds. So all of this sounds harsh. You know, it's a harsh reality, I would say, in international development. It's still very exciting. I still would highly recommend it, but there is a lot of challenge for it. But the main thing to think about is that there is a business of development. Now, this is a term people hate, especially in the nonprofit sector, because by definition, nonprofit means no profit, right? And most organizations will say that we're in this for the idealism. We're in this for impact, social impact. We're not in this for money. So when you say business, it's a business model that can really upset a lot of people. But to my mind, it is a business model. Everything you do as an organization is a business. So despite, what people say, we could say that we should run it like that. We should have a business plan. They should treat the operations of the agency like a business. And certainly all of the projects that are under the umbrella of these agencies' programs should be treated like a business as well. And you should treat the project as a business. So revenue and expenses are going to be tracked, and we're going to talk about budgets later on. And the project development should be assessed for risk, and risk is a process. Risk process is a very important component, and opportunity, just the way any business would. So what are our risks going into this, and what are the opportunities going into this? That's totally outside of what we talk about with our community stakeholders. This is just for the good functioning of our project. So a function of that agency can then be charity, and it should be, but they should always maintain a business focus, at least in theory anyway. So one of my big frustrations is working with Christian nonprofit organizations, and I work with them probably 80% of my time, I would say. And I've been on the board of the Christian Relief and Development Association, still working with them now. But my frustration is that many of these agencies are still holding on to the traditional charity approach to development, and they're uncomfortable moving out of that space. There's a desire to compete in the industry. Like, you'll talk to them, and even especially now with the pandemic, they'll say that, we want to compete. We want to access funds from institutional donors, from governments, want to grow our income, and we want to grow our influence at the same time. But they're uncomfortable when they have to actually start making those decisions to move into that space. So their staff have often come with a passion and a commitment to a particular religious denomination, I would say. So, you can take an example like ADRA, which is the Adventists. They recruit Adventists. If you go to their office, you'll see that everybody there, I think without exception, are Adventists. The PWRDF, which is the Anglicans, they recruit Anglicans. Most of them are, I would say 90% are Anglicans. Assemblies of God, they recruit Pentecostals. And all of them, without exception, are Pentecostal. And that sometimes will supersede, that criteria will supersede the qualification screening for management generally, okay? So what I mean is they hire for culture and compatibility and may not hire for technical expertise, okay? So they hire for culture and compatibility with their organization and may not hire for technical expertise. So as they start to build capacity, they often find that they're lagging behind in their ability to implement more complex and larger projects. So even the bigger Christian agencies, I would say, are struggling with that. Ones like Compassion and World Vision and so on. They still struggle. Then we get into the whole argument around hiring technocrats, but who may not fit the mold for culture, identity, denomination. All right. So you need somebody who's really strong in a certain area, but they don't fit those criteria. So when you guys come in, when you eventually graduate and you come in looking for these jobs, you come in with a much stronger knowledge of the practice of development coming from a Christian university. It's going to be a big plus for you, I guarantee. It's going to be a very big plus. And something you should definitely flag on your CV when you apply for that first job. That needs to really come out as a focus if you're applying in the international development sphere. So I'm giving you that tip for free, guys, because the next one I'm going to charge, but that one's a gimme. I'll let you have that one. But I guarantee that is the case. I do a lot of hiring in the sector, especially with Christian organizations, and a lot of advisory work as well. And I would say that definitely should come out really strongly. And by the way, when we're done as well, for those of you who might go in that direction, certainly you can fall back on me for any reference that you need as well. So I'll just put that out there, that if you require that reference, I'm available to talk to whatever agency you've applied to explain what you've learned and so on. It really is quite something to have students coming out of university that are positioned not only with the theoretical knowledge, but they also have the wherewithal, the practical knowledge as well, and the understanding of what to expect when they arrive out in the field. So I tell you, that's something that's gold. Okay, so that's a long route, around to this idea of saying industry standard. I got a little deviated there. But I always ask, what standard are we talking about? So what is it based on? How did you measure it? We're an incredibly diverse group of agencies in the industry. It takes a lot of time to change and improve in our industry. But the good news is that we're making great progress in numerous areas, like the humanitarian development standards. That's something over the last few years that's really grown into a robust benchmark for the industry. We have development ethics through the Canadian Council for International Cooperation, CCIC, and even in areas of peace building, where they're now looking at getting certification for people going out who are focusing specifically on peace building. And we have people who are really good at building logic models using what our government calls the results-based management framework, or RBM. Wilson mentioned RBM, but I'm not sure if you're familiar with it. But it's how you go about developing logic to build a logic model. And we're going to be doing that after the reading week. So that's something to just sort of keep in the back of your mind. And we have a cadre of M&E staff who really know their stuff in terms of measuring results and reporting for the project. And many of them are going to come in with expertise in process, problem analysis, monitoring and evaluation systems, tools, all of these things. And many of them are also really good trainers. So Wilson's a good example of that. Next week, we have another one Iqbal Ansar Siddiqui. He's coming in, and he's a really good trainer as well for practitioners. So remember that you're the project manager, okay? When you're in that position, your first objective, just the way it was Jesus's first objective when he set out on his mission, what did he do? He went out and found a great team. That was his first job. You go out and find those people that are going to support me and be on my team. And I guarantee to you that the knowledge manager or M&E manager, whatever you want to call him, they're going to be top of your list, okay, right beside the finance manager, because you're going to need him too. But that M&E manager is really super important. So far, we've made little progress, I guess, across the whole industry around project management standards. So what I'm trying to bring out in this course is flagging for you that there is a process, that sometimes it's not recognized, sometimes it's not laid down and actually stated bluntly for what it is, but we all tend to use it and muddle through these basic processes. So I'm extracting from the PMBOK, this body of knowledge, those areas that define a project that you need to manage effectively if you're going to be a good project manager. You can be a project manager, but can you be a good project manager? There's a huge distinction there, big gap. So that's what I'm going to be trying to bring out in this course, is to give you those tools and things that you need when you start up your work. So I've also mentioned the term methodology a few times. This is another one of those terms where you have to be really careful how you use it. And in terms of project design and management, there are all sorts of methodologies out there. And you heard a bit of that today as well with our guest speaker. And we're certainly going to come back to it throughout the course. I'm going to keep circling back to it. But what I want to do is give you a real glimpse into the mechanics and the working guts of project management in international development, and not overwhelm you with all the other stuff that you're not going to use. Okay, so just very quickly, I just wrap up here because we're getting close to the end. I just want to define for you what a methodology is, so that when I'm using the term, you understand what I'm saying. First, what it's not, and it's not a tool, okay? And you're going to hear people use these terms interchangeably. Oh, I got this methodology that I use. Okay, is it a methodology or is it a tool? And you heard Wilson mentioning tool quite a few times as well. So we just need to be really careful how we use that term. When we talk about having a project management methodology, it's defined as a set of practices, techniques, procedures, and rules that are used by those people who work in the discipline. Okay? So before we go any further, the other big elephant in the room that I'll call out is that methodology definition is broad. Okay? In fact, we tend to see all sorts of methodologies being used by different project managers in the sector. Everyone you talk to is probably going to have a different methodology. Some won't have any methodologies at all, and they might even say that having no method is actually a method. That's their method. So I've even actually heard that. Oh, I don't have a specific method, but that's my way of working. That's my style. Well, the reason is that most practitioners will not be familiar enough with what a methodology is, that they don't really know if a project manager is using one or not. And it's really important because the people you're working with need to know if you're actually working with a methodology. It's important for consistency and predictability, right? So if others aren't familiar with what your industry standard is, if it exists at all, then how do they know one's being used, right? So instead, we tend to say that we use other benchmarks. We say, someone is a really good project manager, or they're a really bad project manager, or they'll have good management styles, or they really have a bad management style. I don't like that guy. And unfortunately, it comes down to whether you get along with him or her. That's really what it comes down to. Do we have a good relationship? Do we get along? Great. Okay, then we're pretty good. I don't want to sugarcoat it, because there's a real paucity, I would say, of actual project management methodologies that are being used in the sector. And these are conversely, or there are rather, zillions and zillions of tools that everyone is using, and everyone has their favorite tools as well. And for me, one of the most frustrating things for me as I move around, and for others, you go agency to agency hopping through the sector, and you keep seeing one tool used a lot and another one that the agency hates, and you just get used to using a particular one. And then you go to another place and then suddenly, oh no, we never used that. We had a bad experience with that. So it gets really frustrating. So, one person's going to use a SWOT analysis. You guys have done that. Then you go somewhere else and they say, no, we don't use SWOT. We use PEST because we're more interested in the external environment. Well, after a while, they all kind of blur into one. And you just kind of like take it for granted and kind of brush it off. You need to be familiar with them, but you need to start developing what you like. So for those who are new at it, like yourselves, there's going to be a honeymoon period, I would say, where learning these tools can be really fun. You'll actually enjoy them. You're learning some new tricks and that. But, as I said back in our first class, it's really going to come down to your preferred tools, the ones that you like using, the ones you're comfortable with, and what fits your work style. What's cost effective? What gets the job done effectively? How much time and patience do you have? That could also be one. What's your timeline? And what yields the best results for you at the end of the day and for your project and your agency as well. So it's not going to be useful for me to say to you, use this one or use this one. I'm not going to do that just because of the years of practice that I have, because I won't be able to give all of you the same one and say it's all going to be useful for each and every one of you. All right. So a consistent, transparent, recognizable method to manage your teams and resources effectively. What tools you use are really going to be up to you. Okay. So I want you to be familiar and comfortable with the project management lifecycle. We're going to be coming to that in the next couple of weeks, plus the important management methodologies and techniques that are going to guide you through the phases of project management. So understanding how the processes will fit together, these 9 processes I'm going to describe, plus the project cycle, then how you apply yourself to managing time, cost, and scope, that constraint, that triple constraint. Okay, so when you step off a plane in a particular country, all right, you're about to be introduced to your team. You'll want to hold that very important first meeting. All right, the first meeting you have should be your team meeting. You call everyone together, and at that meeting, you're going to have an opportunity to tell them about yourself, and most importantly, how you work and what you expect. Okay, guarantee this is going to set you on the right track if you do this when you get there, and it helps you get control of your project management environment right away. Get your team together, tell them what you plan to do, explain your work style and what you expect from them. So remember, as a project manager, and I know at least one of you is going to probably be doing project management fairly soon, remember that you are accountable. Okay, as the project manager, you're accountable. Ultimately, you're the chief, you're the CEO. So you're like that CEO of a company where all the departments are going to report into you. And ultimately, the success of your team is your success. Never, never, never forget that. A lot of people do. They get threatened by their team. Sometimes they have really strong people on their team and they get really threatened, think they're going to take their job and all that sort of thing. But remember that if they fail, you fail. If they succeed, you succeed. So building them up is no skin off your back, because at the end of the day, your superiors, the executive, are going to look at you and say, it doesn't really matter what they did. That's your responsibility to figure out. What we want to know is what you did. So ultimately, having a great staff and a staff that understand what it is you're trying to do is going to be gold for you guys. So then you got to figure out what methodology of project management fits your style. Okay. So if you refer to the universal book on project management, that PMBOK guide, you'll have your mind blown by all the technical processes that you could potentially use. And I guess if you know every page, you could probably build the pyramids. But remember, because you have all the science doesn't mean that your team will. Okay. So it's your job to find the methodology of management that will keep all of the pieces together. And every piece is going to have some of those staff in it. They're not all going to be doing everything. They're compartmentalized, right? So you're the one with the grand plan. You're going to have that on your wall probably, or somewhere close to hand, I hope. And you're going to be able to move seamlessly through this multi-year project, moving the pieces like chess pieces on a board. That's going to be your job. And the methodology you pick eventually is going to have a profound effect on how your team works, how happy they are with you, how engaged they are in the project. And honestly, this part is huge because no question, I'm sure you've been on teams before. You have an unhappy team, that's going to be certain failure right off the bat. You can tell. I've walked into offices where all the doors are closed. And I spend the first 3 months just trying to get everyone to open their doors and talk to each other. So that is going to spell disaster. So pick a methodology based on a number of factors. And that could be, how fast do you need to get the job done? Is it something urgent? Or do you need to be comprehensive and really detailed? You may also land in a project halfway and find all these problems that I mentioned, that could already be there. So maybe, you have to spend some time doing human resource repair work before you can do anything else. Or maybe your budget is overspent, seriously, or maybe it's underspent and your project is getting behind in its deliverables. There are all kinds of different things that will be happening in a project when you get plunked down there. So does it call for teamwork? Is that the methodology you should use? Get all hands on deck and really start moving your team? Or is there going to be a sense of urgency in the project? Your donor is cracking a whip across your back. So you need a more autocratic style. You need to be more hands-on, more micromanaging. Staff hate that, but sometimes it's called for. And you need maybe to have more delegation to your staff as well. That could also be something you need to think about. So all these factors that may determine what a methodology is that you choose. So it's not, again, possible for me to say, use this one or use that one. You need to assess every situation for what it is and then determine, what methodology you want to use within your particular management style. Okay, so I'm going to end there, guys, and we're not going to do a photograph this week. Yay! So you won't have to do that because I'm going to let you continue working on your other assignment, which is going to be due for next week. I think we said next Friday for that. So you've got till the end of next week. I am going to provide you with some resources just in the last couple of minutes. And again, I will be posting this on Moodle, so you'll have it. And these were just things that I picked up at different times, sometimes just when I was on the web and I saw something, or maybe I saw some of these shows. But all really interesting shows that you can get online or you can get on Netflix that really get into this issue of the SDGs that we've been talking about, because I'm going to really be basically stopping here in terms of going into detail on them. So any of those, they're pretty fun to watch. But if you have some free time and you want to do a little bit more delving into them, then those are pretty good resources. So for next week, you are doing a concept note or a pitch, as you recall. It's like a pitch to a donor. So implementing agencies, they often submit concept notes first before they do a full proposal. And it's just to tweak the interest of the donor. And the donor might come back and say, hey, I like this. I like the idea. You got a good thing going. Let's do a full proposal. So I'm going to review what you've submitted next week based on if you followed those principles and issues that we've been talking about in the SDGs and managing a project. I want you to convince me that your project is worth funding. Okay, I'm going to be the one funding it. So I'm going to act like the donor. And I'm going to decide, is this something that I want to fund or not? And this is going to sort of be the basis of how I'm going to mark as well. So I want to know that you've understood the basic principles that we've been talking about. And again, my office is open twice next week and tomorrow. So you got 3 opportunities to check in with me if you want and to have any discussion, or if you want to vet any sections of what you're doing. I just want to give you a full opportunity to come back and have a discussion with me, just so that you can fill it out as succinctly as possible. So any questions, guys, on any of that so far? Pretty clear on the exercise? Yeah?
The one thing I didn't know, the assignment 1, that's not due till the Friday after next week's class?
Yeah, Friday.
Okay.
Yeah, it's going to be Friday. So, oops, I'm almost canceling this meeting. I don't want to do that. Okay, there.
What time on Friday is?
You can have until the end of day. I just didn't want to peg it to the class because we're not going to actually have a discussion during the next class. We have a guest speaker coming on as well, and that's going to be a pretty full class. So just deliver it on Friday. I'll look at it over the weekend, and then I'll provide feedback the following week. Yeah. Sound good? Okay, and please avail my office times, I sit here, I open up my Zoom, and you're welcome to jump in and talk about any aspect of your framework that you're developing if you want. If not, I'll assume you guys are on track. And meanwhile, stay out of trouble and stay safe in this pandemic, with all the stuff going on. The second wave, yeah, try and stay safe and isolated. All right, guys.
Awesome. Thank you.
Right.
Fantastic. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Ciao. Bye-bye.